"Do not leave me here," the delicate widow breathed, her voice shattering like thin ice against the heavy mountain gale. The wagon did not slow. The heavy iron wheels of the timber cart ground mercilessly through the deep snow, carrying the brother of her late husband back down the steep, treacherous trail toward the safety of the valley. Evelyn stood entirely alone in the brutal, creeping dark. The freezing wind bit into the pale, translucent skin of her cheeks. She pulled the thin black fabric of her heavy shawl tightly across her chest, trembling so violently she could barely keep her footing in the rising drifts. They had traded her away to settle a family debt. They had abandoned her at the edge of the property of the beast of the mountain. The townspeople below whispered terrible tales about this place. They claimed the giant of the high ridge was a savage, a monster of a man who broke bones with his bare hands and spoke only in violence. But the truth, hiding beneath the heavy timber of this lonely mountain, was far more complicated and far more beautiful than anyone in the valley below could ever imagine. Stay with me until the end of this journey. Hit that like button and comment what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Evelyn stood knee-deep in the freezing drift, the snow soaking through the hem of her dark gray wool traveling dress. The wind carried the sharp, biting scent of pine needles, wet earth, and impending frost. She was utterly exhausted. The sorrow of her past year, the crushing weight of a desolate marriage, and the cruel betrayal of the family she had tried to serve, all pressed down upon her fragile, slender shoulders. She had nothing left to give, and nowhere left to run. Then, the snow crunched. Heavy, methodical footsteps broke the silence of the clearing. A massive shadow detached itself from the dark tree line. Evelyn stopped breathing. The rumors had not exaggerated the size of the man. He was a towering mountain of a human being. He wore a heavy canvas coat lined with thick sheepskin, his broad shoulders easily blocking out the pale light of the rising moon. Thick dark brown hair fell past the collar of his coat, and a rugged, full beard framed a face carved by years of total isolation and harsh winters. A pale, jagged scar ran along the lower left edge of his jaw, a brutal reminder of the wildness of this unforgiving place. He carried a massive iron axe in one hand. The thick hickory handle looked like a mere twig against his sheer size and heavy physical build. Evelyn stumbled backward. The leather boots of the fragile woman caught in a deep snowdrift. She fell hard against the frozen trunk of a fallen pine tree, the rough bark scraping through her wool dress. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird inside a tiny cage. She squeezed her sorrowful emerald-green eyes shut, bracing for the cruelty she had come to expect from the harsh world. She expected a heavy hand. She expected shouting. The heavy footsteps stopped just a few feet away. The heat radiating from his massive frame fought against the bitter wind, creating a pocket of sudden warmth in the freezing air. Evelyn opened her eyes and looked up. He towered over her, completely eclipsing the night sky. The sheer physical presence of the man was terrifying. He looked at the snow, then at the empty trail where the wagon had vanished, and finally, his intense, soulful brown eyes locked onto her fragile, shivering form. She clutched her black shawl tighter, an instinctive, desperate shield against the looming giant. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the moaning wind. "Do not hurt me." For a suspended, heavy moment, the forest held its breath. Then, the giant moved. He did not step forward. He did not reach out to grab the delicate woman. He did not speak a single word of dominance or anger. Instead, the fierce mountain man dropped his heavy iron axe directly into the deep snow. The heavy thud echoed softly through the clearing. Then, with deliberate and profound slowness, the massive man bent his knees. He sank straight down into the freezing, wet drift, lowering his towering frame until he was kneeling on the frozen earth. He brought himself down, entirely surrendering his intimidating height, until his dark eyes were perfectly level with the face of the terrified widow. It was an act of complete, astonishing humility. A man who could have easily dominated the situation chose to strip away every ounce of his power. Evelyn stared at him, absolute shock piercing through her blind terror. The eyes of the giant were not savage. They were deeply gentle, carrying a quiet, heavy sorrow that mysteriously mirrored the grief inside her own heart. There was no cruelty in the weathered lines of his face. There was only profound, unwavering restraint. He knelt in the biting snow, entirely indifferent to the freezing dampness seeping into the knees of his dark trousers, simply to prove to a terrified, broken woman that he was not a threat to her safety. A strange, impossible warmth flickered deep within the chest of Evelyn. It was the very first time in her life a man had ever made himself smaller so she could feel safe. He stayed exactly where he was, giving her the quiet space she needed to breathe. The wind howled around them, whipping the long, loose, wavy auburn hair across her pale face. But the air between the two strangers felt suddenly still. He was acting as a massive shield against the gale, blocking the worst of the biting mountain cold with the sheer width of his shoulders. Slowly, the giant raised one massive, calloused hand. He did not reach for her. He simply extended his arm, keeping his palm open, and rested his hand gently in the empty space between them. The leather of his thick glove was worn and scarred, telling the silent story of endless hard labor and honorable survival. The gesture was a pure invitation. It was a silent promise of shelter and protection. Evelyn looked at his rough hand, then looked back up into his intense, quiet eyes. Her violent trembling began to slow, not from the cold, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that perhaps the true monsters of the world did not live on the high mountain. Perhaps they lived in the valley she had just left behind. She tentatively unclasped one pale hand from her dark shawl. The delicate fingers of the suffering widow hovered in the freezing air, inexplicably drawn toward the sheer, solid dependability of the quiet giant kneeling before her in the snow. Before she could bridge the gap, a vicious, unnatural crack echoed from the absolute black depths of the forest. It was not the sound of falling timber. It was a heavy, violent snap of thick bone and dead wood, followed immediately by a low, vibrating growl that shook the frost from the pine branches high above them. The giant froze. His open hand tightened instantly into a massive, rigid fist. The gentle, soulful warmth in his eyes vanished entirely, replaced in a fraction of a second by the lethal, calculating instincts of an apex protector. He did not look back at Evelyn. His intense gaze locked onto the absolute darkness of the dense tree line. Something massive and hungry was moving through the heavy timber, and it was watching them from the shadows. The deep growl vibrated through the frozen earth, traveling straight upward into the thin leather soles of the boots of the widow. Silas rose from the deep snow with a terrifying, explosive speed that completely defied his massive frame. He did not stumble. He did not run. He stepped backward, placing his towering body firmly between the fragile, trembling woman and the absolute darkness of the trembling pine branches. He became an immediate, impenetrable wall of heavy canvas, broad shoulders, and unyielding muscle. He retrieved his massive iron axe from the snowdrift with one smooth, lethal motion. His intense brown eyes never left the shadows. He reached back his free hand, the thick leather of his glove hovering just an inch from the shivering arm of Evelyn. He gestured sharply toward a faint, flickering yellow glow visible through the dense timber on the rising ridge behind them. He pointed, then looked back to her, giving a single, urgent nod. Evelyn understood the silent command. She did not hesitate. She turned and forced her freezing legs to move, pushing through the heavy drifts toward the distant light. Behind her, she could hear the crunch of heavy boots. Silas walked backward, keeping his massive body positioned as a permanent shield between her fragile back and whatever beast prowled the winter night. The wind shrieked, biting at the pale skin of her cheeks, but the immediate terror of the valley faded into a singular, desperate focus on the glowing window of the cabin. Consider the nature of true shelter, my friends. A house is merely timber and stone, but true shelter is a place where a frightened soul can finally lower its defenses. They reached the heavy wooden door of the mountain cabin. Silas stepped past her, pushing the thick oak timber open with a heavy shove. He stood aside, gesturing for her to enter first. Evelyn stepped across the threshold, and the sudden sensory shift was overwhelming. The immediate blast of glorious, radiant heat washed over her freezing face. The air inside smelled deeply of burning hickory, dried mountain sage, and well-worn leather. The wind abruptly cut off as Silas pulled the heavy door shut, dropping a massive, solid iron crossbar into place with a resounding, final clang. The storm was locked outside. The immediate danger of the dark woods was completely severed from them. Evelyn stood frozen near the wall, clutching her dark shawl tightly against her chest. She watched the giant with wide, sorrowful emerald eyes. Silas ignored her completely, but not out of malice. He moved with a deliberate, heavy grace, fully aware that his sheer physical size was overwhelming within the enclosed walls. He did not wish to frighten her further. He crossed the room, pulling his thick sheepskin coat from his broad shoulders and hanging it upon an iron hook. He stoked the glowing embers in the great stone hearth, adding 2 thick logs of dried cedar. The fire leaped to life, casting a rich, golden light across the rustic, perfectly organized cabin. He turned toward an iron pot suspended over the flames. Using a thick rag, he poured a generous portion of thick, steaming stew into a carved wooden bowl. He walked to the heavy, rough-hewn table in the center of the room, set the bowl down, and placed a wooden spoon beside it. He stepped away, walking to the far corner of the room, and simply looked at her. He offered a slow, respectful nod toward the food. It was a silent offering of pure life. Evelyn approached the table with hesitant, trembling steps. She sat upon the heavy wooden bench. The steam rising from the bowl kissed her freezing face. She took a slow bite. The rich, savory warmth of venison, wild mountain root, and wild thyme exploded upon her tongue. It was the most glorious thing she had ever tasted. The heat spread down her throat, melting the deep, bitter frost that had settled inside her bones. She ate quietly, watching the mountain man from the corner of her eye. The men of the valley, the brothers of her late husband, paraded themselves as gentlemen. They wore fine suits and spoke loudly of honor in the town square. Yet, those same gentlemen had treated her like discarded property, throwing her to the wolves to settle a financial ledger. This massive, scarred man of the high ridge, the supposed savage they whispered about in terrified tones, had not spoken a single word to her. Yet, He had dropped to his knees to ease her terror, shielded her from a mountain beast, and was now feeding her from his own scarce winter supplies. When she finished the meal, Silas moved again. The cabin possessed only one bed. It was a large, heavy timber frame nestled deep in the warmest corner, piled high with thick furs and a beautiful, heavy wool quilt. Silas walked to the bed, but he did not lie down. Instead, he pulled a single, coarse gray blanket from beneath the quilt. He turned and walked back across the room, stopping directly in front of the locked heavy oak door. With quiet, methodical movements, the massive man laid the coarse blanket across the hard, drafty wooden floor planks. He sat down upon the unyielding wood, resting his broad back against the heavy door itself. He stretched his long, heavy legs across the threshold, folding his arms over his chest. He closed his intense brown eyes. Evelyn stared in absolute wonder. The giant had surrendered his own warm, comfortable bed to a complete stranger. By sleeping directly against the locked door, he was silently promising that absolutely nothing, not the beast in the woods, nor the cruel men of the valley, would ever reach her without going through him first. It was an act of profound, sacred protection. Physical relief finally washed over the exhausted widow. Her lingering wariness began to mix with a profound, terrifying emotional distance. She did not know how to accept such unconditional kindness. She moved to the soft, warm furs of the bed, lying down fully clothed in her dark gray traveling dress. The cabin grew perfectly silent, save for the crackle of the cedar logs and the deep, even breathing of the guardian resting upon the hard floor. Evelyn could not close her eyes. Her mind raced with the sheer impossibility of her situation. She turned her head, letting her gaze wander through the golden shadows of the peaceful room. Her eyes drifted to the heavy stone mantel, situated directly above the roaring fire. There, resting carefully upon the smoothed stone, was an object entirely out of place in the rugged, harsh world of a lone fur trapper. It was a beautifully carved wooden toy. It was a tiny, perfect rendering of a delicate songbird, polished to a high, flawless shine, with intricate details carefully etched into the tiny wings. Evelyn felt a sharp ache in her chest. The delicate toy was clearly meant for the tiny hands of a child. Who did the fierce giant of the mountain make this for? The morning light pierced through the frosted window panes of the heavy timber cabin, casting long, pale beams across the floorboards. Evelyn stirred beneath the immense weight of the thick wool quilt. The fire in the great stone hearth had been carefully banked, leaving a steady, radiant heat that kept the bitter mountain chill entirely at bay. She sat up slowly, the soft furs shifting around her fragile shoulders. She looked toward the heavy oak door. The coarse gray blanket was neatly folded upon the table. The massive iron crossbar was lifted from its cradle. The giant was gone. She stood, shivering slightly as her feet touched the cool floorboards. She wrapped her dark shawl tightly across her chest, a familiar and instinctive shield against the world. She walked to the small, square window and rubbed away the condensation from the glass with her pale fingers. The world outside was a blinding, pristine expanse of fresh white snow. The violent storm of the previous night had broken, leaving the mountain in absolute, deafening peace. Her emerald green eyes scanned the clearing, stopping abruptly near the edge of the dark tree line. Silas was out there in the freezing morning air. The massive mountain man was kneeling in the deep snow once again. This time, he was not lowering himself to ease the terror of a delicate widow. He was kneeling beside a wild, frightened creature of the woods. A young doe lay trapped in a deep snowdrift, The slender leg of the animal was bent at a terrible, unnatural angle. Evelyn held her breath, watching through the thick glass. The hunters of the valley would simply pull a rifle from their shoulders and end the life of the creature without a second thought. They would view the broken animal only as an easy meal. Silas did not carry a weapon. The towering giant reached out his massive hands. They were the very same hands the townspeople swore could crush solid bone. He hovered his scarred, calloused fingers just above the trembling flank of the wounded doe. He did not grab. He did not force his will upon the panicked creature. He waited with impossible, unending patience. He emitted a low, rumbling hum from deep within his broad chest. The sound was a steady, rhythmic vibration that carried through the crisp winter air. Animals cannot be deceived by fine words or tailored suits. A wild creature relies purely upon instinct to survive the brutal realities of nature. They possess an ancient, unspoken ability to see the true worth of a soul. Slowly, incredibly, the terrified doe stopped thrashing. The wild animal rested its heavy head against the frozen earth, surrendering entirely to the towering man beside it. Silas brought his heavy hands down upon the broken limb. His movements were a study in extreme, deliberate slowness. He possessed the sheer physical strength to tear the pines from the soil. Yet he applied the wooden splint with the profound, delicate grace of a seasoned physician. Evelyn felt a sudden, powerful tightness grip her throat. She pressed her forehead against the freezing glass pane. A profound realization washed through her weary spirit. The men of the valley, the respected gentlemen of high society, had taken immense pleasure in breaking her spirit piece by piece. They were the true monsters. The fierce, terrifying beast of the high ridge spent his mornings quietly mending the broken things of the world. She stepped away from the window. She adjusted the heavy black shawl around her shoulders. She walked to the heavy oak door and pushed it open. The biting softness, freezing air hit her pale face instantly, carrying the sharp, pure scent of pine needles and undisturbed frost. She stepped off the wooden porch. The snow crunched loudly beneath the thin leather soles of her boots. Silas heard the sound. He looked up sharply. His intense, soulful brown eyes widened in surprise as he saw the delicate widow wading through the knee-deep drifts toward him. He shook his head. A single, sharp motion ordering her back to the warmth of the cabin. Evelyn ignored the silent command. She reached the edge of the clearing. The doe panicked at the arrival of a second human, thrashing its head and attempting to kick its uninjured legs. Silas struggled to hold the wooden splint in place while simultaneously trying to calm the thrashing animal. The massive man could not manage the heavy cloth bandage without letting go of the broken bone. Evelyn did not hesitate. She dropped to her knees in the freezing snow, sinking into the wet drift directly opposite the giant. Just as he had lowered himself to her level the night before, she now abandoned the safety of her distance to enter his world. She reached out her pale, trembling hands. She bypassed the broken leg entirely and placed her delicate palms firmly upon the warm, heaving neck of the wild doe. "Shh," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic stream of air. "You are safe. We will not hurt you." The doe looked at the sorrowful green eyes of the widow. The breathing of the animal slowed. The thrashing stopped. Silas stared at Evelyn across the back of the wild creature. A look of absolute wonder broke through the stoic, weathered lines of his scarred face. He offered a slow, deeply respectful nod. It was a silent acknowledgement of her quiet courage. They worked together in the bitter cold. The massive mountain man and the fragile widow functioned in perfect, unspoken harmony. Silas aligned the heavy wooden splint. Evelyn held the thick cloth bandage taut. The ice of fear that had locked her heart for a year finally began to thaw, replaced by the profound, undeniable warmth of mutual respect. Silas reached across the leg of the animal to secure the final knot of the heavy fabric. As he pulled the coarse cloth tight, the beaver, the thick, calloused knuckles of the mountain man, accidentally brushed directly against the pale, freezing fingers of Evelyn. It was the briefest, softest physical contact. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. Silas did not blush. He did not smile. He flinched with violent, explosive terror. He ripped his massive hand away, as if the delicate skin of the widow had burned him with white-hot iron. A look of sheer, profound agony tore across his rugged features. He stumbled backward, falling heavily onto his hands in the deep snow. His broad chest heaved as he stared at his own trembling fingers in absolute horror. He refused to look at her face. The stoic guardian was entirely gone, replaced by a man completely shattered by a simple touch. Evelyn knelt in the snow, her pale hands suspended over the resting doe. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Why did the gentle touch of a fragile woman cause the fierce giant so much terror? There is a profound, sacred rhythm to the quiet chores of a true home. My friends, when the human heart is shattered by the cruelty of the world, sometimes the simple act of creating warmth for another soul can stitch the broken pieces back together. The fierce mountain man had fled into the dense timber immediately after their accidental touch. He left the fragile widow kneeling alone in the deep, freezing snow. Evelyn did not pursue him. She understood the deep terror of a wounded spirit perfectly. Instead, she managed to coax the injured doe into a small, dry wooden lean-to situated beside the main building. She piled dry straw beneath the resting creature, ensuring the wild animal was protected from the freezing mountain wind. Then, the delicate widow returned to the heavy timber walls of the cabin. The home of the mountain man was meticulously organized, yet it felt entirely devoid of life. It was the quiet, echoing shelter of a solitary ghost. The heavy wooden table was completely bare. A thin layer of pale dust settled upon the corners of the stone hearth. Evelyn realized she possessed absolutely no money to repay the towering giant for his incredible protection. She possessed no fine goods to offer in exchange for her safety. She possessed only her own 2 hands. She walked to the humble wooden cupboards built into the thick log walls. She searched the quiet shelves. She discovered a heavy canvas sack of milled wheat flour, a small glass jar of wild mountain yeast, a tin of coarse salt, and a block of cured lard. She turned away from the cupboards. She looked at the crackling fire in the great stone hearth. For the very first time since the tragic death of her husband, Evelyn reached up and untied the heavy black shawl from her fragile shoulders. She draped the dark, mournful fabric across the back of the wooden chair. It was a deliberate, powerful act of lowering her emotional shield. She pushed up the long sleeves of her dark gray wool dress, exposing her pale, slender wrists. She was a woman discarded by the gentlemen of the valley, but she refused to be entirely useless upon the high ridge. She poured the flour into a wide wooden bowl. She mixed the mountain yeast with warm water drawn from the iron pot over the fire. She worked the heavy dough upon the rough-hewn table. The intense physical labor demanded a deep strength she did not know she still possessed. Her pale skin flushed with a radiant, healthy color. The quiet, rhythmic motion of kneading the bread brought a profound, sweeping peace to her racing mind. She fed the fire with dry cedar logs until the heavy cast-iron oven grew incredibly hot. She shaped the dough into 2 beautiful, round loaves, and placed them carefully inside the dark iron chamber. Soon, the glorious, intoxicating fragrance of baking bread filled the entire cabin. It was the pure, rich scent of survival, comfort, and enduring home. The harsh, bitter smell of the lonely winter was entirely banished from the heavy timber walls. Evelyn swept the floorboards, wiped the dust from the heavy stone mantel, and arranged a clean, welcoming space upon the wooden table. The sun dipped below the high western ridge, casting deep violet shadows across the freezing snow outside. The heavy oak door creaked open. The freezing wind howled into the room for a brief second before the door was pushed shut. Silas stepped across the threshold. The towering giant carried a massive bundle of chopped firewood in his thick, powerful arms. He expected the usual, crushing silence of his isolated existence. He expected the bitter chill of a lonely, dark room. He inhaled the warm air of the cabin. The massive bundle of firewood slipped from his heavy arms. The dry logs tumbled onto the floorboards with a loud, clattering crash. Silas stopped entirely frozen in his tracks. The intense, guarded stoicism of his scarred face shattered instantly. His broad shoulders slumped forward beneath the weight of his thick canvas coat. He closed his soulful brown eyes. A look of absolute, heartbreaking wonder washed over the fierce mountain man. He breathed in the rich, sweet aroma of the fresh bread. He looked as though he had wandered through a freezing desert for a bitter decade, and had finally, miraculously stumbled upon a flowing spring of sweet water. The profound isolation of the giant cracked wide open in the face of such simple, domestic grace. He opened his eyes and looked across the room. Evelyn stood near the glowing hearth. Her delicate face was dusted lightly with white flour. Her pale hands were clasped respectfully in front of her dark wool dress. The mournful black shawl was completely gone from her shoulders. She had transformed the cold, isolated shelter into a place of radiant, undeniable warmth. Silas stared at her in complete awe. He removed his heavy gloves slowly, tossing them upon the wooden bench. He walked to the heavy table with slow, hesitant steps. Evelyn reached into the warm oven. She placed a hot, golden loaf of bread directly before him, alongside a small dish of melted lard. The massive man sat upon the bench. He lifted a thick, warm slice in his calloused, scarred hands with extreme reverence. He did not devour the meal like a starving beast. He took a slow, delicate bite. He closed his eyes once more. A heavy, ragged exhale escaped his broad chest. It was a sound of profound, overwhelming emotional surrender. He was accepting the warmth she offered. They were establishing a silent, cooperative routine. He provided the impenetrable physical shield against the brutal outside world, and she provided the essential, glowing emotional warmth that made the bitter survival worthwhile. A quiet, steady emotional safety began to build between the trembling widow and the scarred protector. Yet, the peaceful sanctuary of the cabin was destined to be short-lived. When he finished the bread, Silas did not immediately return to his post by the heavy door. He reached deep inside the pocket of his heavy canvas coat. He withdrew a small, crumpled object. He set it gently upon the center of the wooden table. It was a sealed paper envelope. The thick parchment was slightly damp from the melted snow of the mountain trail. Silas tapped the paper once with a thick, calloused finger. He gestured toward the empty trail, leading down into the valley, indicating he had found the letter, dropped in the snow exactly where the heavy timber cart had abandoned her the previous night. Evelyn stared at the paper. The quiet, comfortable warmth of the cabin suddenly vanished. replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. She recognized the heavy red wax seal immediately. It bore the unmistakable, cruel crest of the family of her late husband. The men of the valley had left a written message specifically for the beast of the mountain. What cruel, malicious lie did the family of her late husband write about her? The thick parchment sat upon the heavy wooden table, radiating a terrible, suffocating presence. Evelyn stared at the heavy red wax seal. The cruel crest of the family of her late husband pressed deep into the dried wax. The beautiful, glowing warmth she had carefully built within the heavy timber walls of the cabin vanished instantly. The rich scent of the baked bread was entirely eclipsed by the bitter memory of the valley below. She reached out with pale, trembling fingers. She touched the cold wax. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the malice of the men who had discarded her in the freezing snow. Silas remained perfectly still upon the wooden bench. The massive mountain man watched her with intense, quiet brown eyes. He did not rush her. He offered no demands. He simply waited, allowing the fragile widow the space to face the demons of her past. With a sharp, agonizing breath, Evelyn broke the seal. The snap of the wax echoed violently in the quiet room. She unfolded the thick paper. The handwriting was elegant, swirling with the refined education of the gentleman of the valley. Yet, the words themselves were absolute poison. Her emerald green eyes scanned the dark ink. To the savage of the high ridge, the letter began. The woman we leave upon your trail is a known thief. She stole the rightful inheritance of her late husband. She possesses no honor and carries no value. She is a burden to civilized society. We surrender all responsibility for her survival. You may use her for harsh labor, break her spirit, or do with her exactly as you please. No citizen of the valley will ever come looking for her. The thin paper trembled violently in the hands of the suffering widow. Tears spilled from her sorrowful eyes, dropping heavily onto the cruel ink. The profound, suffocating shame crashed over her delicate shoulders. They had not merely abandoned her to die in the freezing snow. They had actively attempted to destroy her humanity. They had given a rumored monster written permission to treat her as nothing more than an abused animal. She lowered her head. A quiet, broken sob escaped her throat. She could not fight anymore. The world was too cruel, and the lies were too heavy. With shaking hands, Evelyn pushed the open letter across the rough surface of the table toward the towering giant. She squeezed her eyes shut. She braced her fragile body for the inevitable explosion of anger. She expected the mountain man to read the elegant words, believe the lies of the respected gentleman, and cast her out into the freezing night. Silas looked down at the parchment. The fierce guardian did not read the elegant handwriting. He did not care about the elaborate crest pressed into the red wax. He looked at the tear-stained cheeks of the widow. He looked at the white flower dusted lightly across her pale forehead. He remembered the incredible, fearless gentleness of her delicate hands resting upon the neck of the wild doe just hours before. A true predator does not heal the broken. A true thief does not bake bread for a stranger. The wild creatures of the mountain recognized her pure heart, and the giant recognized it, too. He possessed absolute faith in the truth of actions over the deception of written words. Silas reached across the table with his massive, calloused hand. He picked up the heavy parchment. He crumpled the cruel letter into a tight, insignificant ball of trash. Evelyn opened her tearful eyes, gasping in shock as the giant stood from the wooden bench. He walked directly to the roaring fire in the great stone hearth. Without a single moment of hesitation, Silas threw the crumpled paper straight into the glowing orange embers. The flames caught the edges instantly. The elegant lies of the valley curled, blackened, and turned to ash in a matter of seconds. The heavy red wax hissed and melted away into nothingness. The mountain man turned back to face the room. He walked to the table. He stood towering over the fragile woman. Slowly, with profound deliberation, Silas rested his thick, scarred hand flat upon the wooden surface, directly beside her plate. He kept his palm open. It was the exact same silent gesture of shelter he had offered in the deep snow. He was explicitly telling her that the words of the valley held absolutely no power inside the timber walls of his home. He believed in her honor. A wave of overwhelming, crushing relief washed through the chest of the widow. The deepening trust between them forged a sudden, powerful emotional bond. She was safe. She was, finally, truly seen. She reached out her trembling fingers, intending to lay her hand softly over his scarred knuckles in quiet gratitude. Before her pale skin could brush against the heavy leather of his glove, a sharp, piercing whistle tore through the quiet air outside the cabin. Silas pulled his hand back instantly. His broad shoulders went completely rigid. The tender, protective warmth vanished from his scarred face, replaced immediately by the cold, lethal focus of the guardian. The heavy crunch of approaching hooves sounded from the edge of the clearing. A horse was moving through the deep snow. Silas moved to the heavy oak door. He lifted the iron crossbar with effortless strength. He pushed the door open and stepped out onto the freezing wooden porch. He left Evelyn safely inside, positioning his massive frame to block the doorway entirely. Evelyn stood from the table, clutching her dark shawl. She peeked around the broad back of the mountain man. A rider sat upon a dark, exhausted horse at the edge of the tree line. The man wore the heavy wool coat of a valley deputy. He kept a very careful, terrified distance from the towering giant on the porch. The deputy did not dare to dismount. "You found the widow," the rider called out over the biting wind, pointing a gloved finger toward the open door. "The brother of her late husband sent me up the trail." He realized the woman took more than we thought. Silas stood perfectly silent. He crossed his massive arms over his broad chest. His intense brown eyes glared at the terrified messenger. "You must listen to me." "Mountain man," the rider shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "The family of her husband declared her a fugitive of the law. They placed a bounty of $50 upon her head. By morning, the hunters of the valley will climb this ridge to collect the money." The deputy pulled the reins of his horse, turning the animal back toward the dark trail. "She legally belongs to the estate of the brother," the rider yelled over his shoulder. "Do not try to hide her. You cannot fight the law." The horse plunged back into the dark timber, leaving the clearing in absolute, freezing silence. Silas turned slowly, looking back into the warm cabin. His intense eyes locked onto the terrified face of Evelyn. The lies of the paper were burned, but the cruel reality of the world was marching up the mountain. How could a lone, silent giant possibly protect a fragile woman who legally belonged to another family? The ringing echo of the heavy iron crossbar faded into the thick timber walls. Silas stood with his broad back pressed firmly against the heavy oak door. The fierce guardian had projected an image of absolute, impenetrable strength to the cowardly rider of the valley. He had stood upon the freezing wooden porch like a permanent, unyielding monument of stone, staring down the approaching danger without a single flinch. Yet, the very moment the threat of the deputy retreated into the dark timber, the terrifying illusion shattered. Silas took one heavy, dragging step away from the door. He did not look at the delicate widow, standing near the table. His broad shoulders hitched suddenly. A violent, terrible shudder ripped through his towering frame. He reached out blindly, his thick, defiant, calloused hand missing the edge of the wooden bench entirely. Then, the massive mountain man crumbled. He collapsed hard against the unyielding floorboards. The immense weight of his heavy physical build shook the entire cabin. He did not extend his massive arms to brace his fall. He lay completely motionless upon the hard wood, his scarred face turned toward the glowing hearth. Evelyn stood frozen in absolute horror. The terrifying reality of the approaching valley hunters instantly vanished from her mind, entirely eclipsed by a far more immediate, devastating panic. She dropped her dark shawl. She rushed across the room, the thin leather soles of her boots sliding against the dusty planks. She fell to her knees beside his unmoving form. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before pressing her pale, trembling hands directly against his broad chest. The heat radiating from his thick canvas coat was completely unnatural. It was not the comforting, radiant warmth of a healthy hearth. It was the terrifying, consuming heat of a raging fever. Her emerald green eyes widened in shock. She pulled open the heavy layers of the thick sheepskin coat. A dark, terrifying stain soaked the left side of his faded flannel shirt. She carefully unbuttoned the worn fabric. Beneath the heavy clothing, wrapped tightly in blood-soaked strips of coarse linen, was a severe, festering wound stretching across his lower ribs. The jagged laceration looked like the brutal aftermath of a hunting accident or a desperate struggle in the wilderness. The skin surrounding the deep injury burned with a furious, angry red infection. The profound truth of the situation crashed over the fragile widow like a heavy wave. The fierce mountain man had been suffering from a lethal infection for days. He had ignored the agonizing pain to drag massive bundles of chopped firewood through the deep, freezing snow. He had ignored the blinding fever to kneel in the bitter wind and mend the broken leg of the wild doe. He had pushed his failing body to the absolute brink of death, purely to stand in the freezing night and act as a massive shield for a broken woman he did not even know. It was an act of pure, sacred sacrifice. The respected gentleman of the valley had demanded everything from her and offered absolutely nothing but cruelty. This terrifying giant of the high ridge had given every ounce of his remaining life and asked for absolutely nothing in return. Evelyn refused to let the silent guardian die. She could not possibly lift his massive frame to carry him to the soft bed in the corner. Instead, she stood and gathered the thick furs and the heavy wool quilt. She built a warm, comfortable pallet directly upon the floorboards beside the roaring fire. She returned to his side, gripping his broad shoulders. Immense, with straining effort, she rolled his towering body onto the soft bedding. The terrified, trembling woman who had fallen into the snowdrift the previous night was entirely gone. In her place emerged a fierce, relentless protector. She possessed almost no physical strength, but she possessed an endless, unyielding well of emotional endurance. She moved rapidly across the cabin. She swung the heavy iron pot directly over the hottest flames of the stone hearth. She found dried mountain sage and wild thyme hidden within the small wooden cupboards. She placed the dried herbs into a small wooden bowl, using a smooth, heavy river stone to grind them into a fine powder. She mixed the crushed herbs with boiling water, creating a thick, fragrant drawing poultice. She lifted the hem of her dark gray wool dress and deliberately tore the clean, white cotton of her own underskirt into long, even bandages. She knelt beside the giant once more. She washed the terrifying wound with the hot water, her delicate hands moving with absolute, unwavering purpose. She applied the warm, herbal poultice directly against the burning infection. Silas groaned deeply in the dark depths of his unconscious state. His massive chest heaved, fighting the sharp pain. Evelyn placed her pale hands firmly against his thick shoulders. She anchored his thrashing body to the earth. She lowered her head and began to emit a steady, rhythmic hum. She returned the exact same soothing, vibrating grace the giant had used to calm the terrified doe. Slowly, the heavy muscles of the mountain man relaxed beneath her touch. She wrapped the clean cotton strips tightly around his broad torso, binding the wound with profound care. The fierce winter wind shrieked against the frosted window panes of the cabin. The storm of the world raged outside, but inside the heavy timber walls, a sacred, quiet battle for life raged on. Evelyn sat upon the floorboards beside the giant for hours. She bathed his burning forehead with a damp cloth. She carefully dripped cool, clean water past his cracked lips. She watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, refusing to close her sorrowful eyes for even a single moment. He had protected her from the monsters of the world. She would protect him from the quiet thief of the night. Deep in the blackest hour of the mountain darkness, the consuming fever reached a terrifying peak. Silas shifted violently upon the thick furs. His intense brown eyes remained firmly shut, trapped within a dark, agonizing nightmare. His thick, calloused hands curled into tight, trembling fists, grasping blindly at the empty air. He fought invisible ghosts in the heavy silence of the cabin. Evelyn leaned closer, placing her cool, pale hand directly over his scarred knuckles to offer her comforting presence. The fierce giant parted his lips. He spoke his very first words of the entire journey. His deep, rumbling voice was completely shattered by a lifetime of hidden agony and crushing guilt. "Amelia," the massive man breathed, his voice cracking with profound, absolute devastation. "Please. I am so sorry. Forgive me." Evelyn froze. Her pale hand hovered over the face of the broken giant. The strange name hung heavily in the quiet air, loaded with a tragic, unresolved sorrow, whose death is the fierce giant blaming himself for. The pale, creeping light of the early morning finally pierced the frosted window panes of the heavy timber cabin. The violent storm of the long, agonizing night surrendered to the quiet, freezing dawn. Evelyn sat upon the hard floorboards beside the roaring hearth, her fragile shoulders aching immensely from the dark, terrifying vigil. The sharp, clean scent of the melting frost outside battled against the heavy, earthy smell of the dried mountain sage and the crushed wild thyme within the small room. The broad chest of the massive mountain man rose and fell with a steady, deeply peaceful rhythm. The terrifying heat of the consuming fever was entirely gone. Silas slowly opened his intense brown eyes. The dark, suffocating shadows of his agonizing nightmare faded away into the soft, golden light of the warm cabin. He did not move immediately. He felt a firm, comforting tightness wrapping completely around his lower ribs. He lowered his rugged, scarred face to look at his own torso. He saw the clean, white cotton of the delicate underskirt of the widow, torn into neat strips and wrapped around his broken body with profound, meticulous care. He understood the immense gravity of the sacrifice immediately. A fragile woman who possessed absolutely no wealth and no spare clothing in the entire world had deliberately destroyed her own garments, simply to stitch his failing body back together. The fierce giant turned his head toward the heavy wooden bench. Evelyn rested her pale cheek against the rough timber. Her sorrowful emerald green eyes closed in deep, utter exhaustion. A look of absolute, breathtaking reverence washed over the rugged features of the mountain man. He slowly extended his massive, calloused hand toward her. He did not dare to touch her delicate skin. Instead, he simply laid his thick, scarred palm flat upon the floorboards right beside her thin leather boots. It was the same familiar, silent gesture he used to offer shelter, but this time, it was a powerful vow of eternal, undeniable gratitude. The profound, sacred peace of the morning shattered instantly. The heavy, thundering sound of approaching horses violently tore through the freezing air outside the cabin. Deep, vicious barking echoed from the dark timber. Evelyn jolted awake with a sharp gasp. The blind, paralyzing terror returned to her pale face in a single fraction of a second. She scrambled backward, clutching the dark fabric of her wool, dressed tightly against her chest. The hunters of the valley had not waited for the morning sun to fully rise over the high ridge. Silas pushed his massive frame up from the thick furs. A sharp, terrible grimace of pain flashed across his weathered face. Yet the fierce guardian did not make a single sound of complaint. He forced his heavy legs to stand. He reached for his heavy canvas coat, pulling the thick sheepskin over his broad shoulders to completely hide the white cotton bandages binding his terrible wound. Evelyn rushed forward in a panic, pressing her, trembling, pale hands gently against his heavy coat. She shook her head, desperately, pleading with him silently to remain upon the floor and protect his healing body. He looked down into her terrified green eyes. The massive giant emitted a low, gentle rumble from deep within his broad chest. He reached up, placing his heavy hand over her delicate fingers for just a brief, grounding second, offering an overwhelming sense of emotional safety. Then, he moved her gently aside. He walked directly to the heavy oak door. He placed his massive, towering body between the trembling woman and the outside world, instantly resuming his role as her permanent, unyielding shield. Silas lifted the massive iron crossbar. He pushed the heavy timber open and stepped out onto the freezing wooden porch. The local sheriff of the valley sat upon a tall, dark horse in the center of the deep snowdrift. Beside him sat a man wrapped tightly in an expensive, dark velvet coat. It was the brother of the late husband of Evelyn. Behind them, half a dozen armed hunters waited with cold, eager eyes and heavy rifles. "Bring out the widow." "Mountain man," the brother demanded loudly, his voice dripping with cruel, arrogant authority over the howling wind. "We know the woman is hiding inside your cabin." Silas crossed his massive, heavy arms over his broad chest. He stared down at the wealthy men of the valley with absolute, lethal silence. "You possess no right to interfere with family business," the brother sneered, pointing a gloved finger aggressively toward the towering giant. "She is a broken, entirely useless thing. I sent her up this wretched mountain trail because I assumed the bitter cold or the wild beasts would finally finish her. Her late husband left behind a vast, wealthy estate, and she stood directly in my way. I will drag her back to the valley, lock her permanently inside the county asylum, and legally claim the inheritance that rightfully belongs to my bloodline." Evelyn stood trembling in the deep shadows of the open doorway. The profound, devastating truth of the betrayal struck her fragile heart like a heavy stone. The cruelty she endured was never about settling a simple family debt. It was a vicious, calculated murder of her quiet spirit purely for financial gain. A powerful emotional reflection washed over her delicate soul. The true savages of the world wore fine velvet coats and manipulated the laws of society, while the true gentlemen of honor stood upon the freezing porch bearing a terribly scarred face. "The law of the valley is entirely clear," the sheriff added, adjusting the heavy silver badge pinned to his thick wool coat. "She legally belongs to the estate of her former family. Step aside, giant, or we will take the woman by absolute force." The freezing winter wind howled through the dark, heavy branches of the pines. The massive mountain man did not flinch. He did not take a single step backward. Silas slowly unfolded his massive arms. He stood to his full, terrifying height, completely ignoring the burning agony of his torn flesh. He locked his intense, soulful brown eyes directly onto the arrogant face of the wealthy brother. "You will not touch the woman," Silas rumbled. His deep, commanding voice carried the unstoppable, heavy force of a mountain rockslide. "She does not belong to your cruel family. She does not belong to your legal estate." The brother laughed, a cold and mocking sound that echoed across the clearing. "And who will possibly stop me? You? A solitary, savage brute living in the dirt. She cannot be taken away," Silas stated, his deep voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. "She is already claimed." The sheriff frowned deeply, leaning forward upon his heavy leather saddle. "Claimed by whom?" The giant did not look back at the trembling widow standing in the shadows, but his heavy words wrapped around her fragile soul like an impenetrable fortress of solid iron. "She is the legal wife of the mountain man," Silas declared into the freezing air. A massive, earth-shattering paradigm shift ripped through the quiet clearing. Evelyn gasped softly, her pale hands flying to cover her mouth. In a single, shocking breath, the fierce giant had elevated her from a discarded, worthless burden to a fiercely protected, honored partner. He had forged a permanent, undeniable alliance out of nothing but his absolute honor. The terrifying monster of the high ridge had just bound his own fate entirely to hers to save her life. The arrogant, this mocking smile completely vanished from the face of the brother. The law of the territory was strict and unforgiving. The legal authority of a new husband completely superseded the claims of the greedy family of a late spouse. The sheriff scowled, pulling the reins of his dark horse back a step. "Spoken words are entirely cheap upon the high ridge," the sheriff shouted angrily, pointing a stern finger toward the massive guardian. "I will not be made a fool by a wild man. If the widow is truly your wife, you must prove the marriage to the court." The sheriff glared at Silas with deep suspicion. "You will ride down to the valley and produce the official marriage certificate at the office of the county clerk by noon tomorrow," the sheriff commanded harshly. "If you fail to present the written document, I will arrest you for kidnapping, and I will hand the fragile woman directly over to the asylum." The riders turned their horses around abruptly, disappearing back into the dark, freezing timber of the downward trail. Silas stepped backward into the radiant warmth of the cabin. He closed the heavy oak door, dropping the massive iron crossbar into place with a resounding clang. He turned slowly to face the terrified woman. The heavy silence of the small room screamed with the impossible reality of the situation they now faced. How could the giant and the widow possibly produce a legal document that absolutely did not exist? Listen to the wind shifting. My friends, when the cruel forces of the world corner a desperate soul, the only remaining path is to step directly into the absolute unknown. The heavy oak door of the cabin remained securely barred against the howling winter night. Silas did not waste a single second pondering the impossible demand of the sheriff. He moved to the small wooden cupboards, retrieving the thick canvas sack. He packed a few dry provisions with swift, deliberate motions. He ignored the burning agony of his torn flesh entirely. The fierce guardian possessed a singular, unwavering objective: to forge the written proof that would save the life of the fragile widow. He walked to the corner of the room. He picked up the heavy wool quilt from the bed. He approached Evelyn, who stood trembling beside the rough-hewn table. Without speaking a single word, the massive mountain man wrapped the thick, colorful wool tightly around her slender shoulders, enveloping her in a cocoon of absolute warmth. They stepped out into the biting, freezing darkness. Silas led an enormous, heavy draft horse from the small wooden lean-to. The beast was massive, possessing thick black hair and broad shoulders that perfectly mirrored the sheer size of the master of the animal. Silas lifted Evelyn from the deep snow with effortless, shocking gentleness, settling her carefully upon the heavy leather saddle. He swung his own towering frame up behind her. They rode down the treacherous mountain trail, under the cover of the black night. The wind shrieked through the dark branches of the pines. Evelyn sat sideways upon the saddle, entirely surrounded by the immense, solid presence of the giant. His broad chest acted as an impenetrable wall against her back, completely blocking the freezing gale. She could feel the steady, deep beating of his heavy heart through the thick canvas of his coat. She was wrapped in the comforting, rich scent of burning cedar, wild mountain sage, and well-worn leather. For the very first time in her tragic, sorrowful life, the terrifying darkness of the world did not frighten her, because the most dangerous creature upon the mountain was the man aggressively protecting her. They reached the floor of the valley long before the morning sun could break the horizon. The settlement of the valley was completely silent. The respected gentlemen of the town slept comfortably in their warm, expensive homes, entirely unaware that the beast of the high ridge walked directly through their quiet streets. Silas guided the massive black horse toward a small, humble white building standing at the very edge of the timberline. It was the parish of the old town preacher. Silas dismounted. He reached up, placing his heavy hands securely around the waist of Evelyn. He lowered her to the frozen earth with profound care. He knocked 3 heavy, commanding times upon the thick wooden door of the parish house. A moment later, the glow of a pale oil lantern flickered to life. The door cracked open. An elderly man with a face full of deep, kind wrinkles peered out into the freezing night. The preacher held the glass lantern high. The pale yellow light illuminated the scarred, rugged face of the mountain man and the fragile, trembling beauty of the pale widow. "The giant of the high ridge," the old man murmured, his voice thick with sleep, but completely entirely devoid of fear. "You bring a delicate bird to my door in the bitter frost of the night." "I require the official paper of the county," Silas rumbled, his deep voice keeping low to avoid waking the sleeping neighbors. "I require the legal certificate of marriage. The morning brings the hunters of the valley." The old preacher looked at the sorrowful, emerald-green eyes of Evelyn. The wise man of faith did not ask for a lengthy explanation. He saw the profound desperation of the fragile woman, and he saw the absolute, honorable determination written across the weathered face of the scarred protector. The preacher pushed the heavy door open, gesturing for them to enter the dark, quiet sanctuary of the church. The interior of the small building smelled heavily of aged pine wood, melted beeswax, and old paper. The shadows danced wildly against the pale walls as the old man walked to a small wooden table near the altar. He opened a heavy, leather-bound ledger. He retrieved a crisp, blank certificate of the county court. He dipped a long, sharp quill into a small glass bottle of dark black ink. "I will sign the legal document to satisfy the cruel laws of the valley," the preacher whispered softly, turning to face the unusual couple. "But a piece of paper possesses no true power. It is only ink and wood. If you wish to build a wall that no man can tear down, you must stand before the altar and speak the vows of heaven. Silas turned his massive frame to look at Evelyn. The fragile widow stood shivering slightly beneath the heavy wool quilt. A powerful, devastating emotional reflection washed completely over her delicate soul. Her first marriage had taken place in a grand, brightly lit parlor, surrounded by wealthy families wearing fine silk and tailored velvet. Yet, that grand ceremony had been entirely hollow, leading only to a life of cruelty, isolation, and profound suffering. Now, she stood in a freezing, dark room, wearing a dusty wool dress, preparing to bind her life to a towering, scarred stranger who had only spoken a handful of words to her. Yet, standing beside the massive giant, she felt a profound, radiant safety she had never known existed. Silas slowly raised his heavy right hand. He did not grab her pale fingers. He opened his thick, calloused palm, leaving his hand hovering quietly in the empty space between them. It was his subtle, recurring gesture of absolute shelter. Evelyn reached out. She placed her delicate, pale hand directly into his massive grip. The sheer size of his hand completely engulfed hers, radiating an impossible, grounding warmth. They stood before the dim light of the beeswax candles. The old preacher spoke the ancient, sacred words of the ceremony. He asked the giant if he would protect, honor, and cherish the fragile woman through every dark storm of life. Silas did not hesitate. The fierce mountain man looked directly into her sorrowful green eyes. "I will," Silas swore, his deep, rumbling voice carrying the eternal weight of the solid mountain stone. He meant every single syllable. It was not a lie constructed for the sheriff. It was a true, absolute vow of his honorable soul. Evelyn felt a hot tear escape her eye, sliding silently down her pale cheek. When the preacher asked her the same sacred question, her voice did not shake. "I will," Evelyn breathed, her soft voice ringing with sudden, beautiful clarity in the quiet church. The old man smiled gently. He turned to the heavy ledger. The sharp scratching of the quill against the thick paper echoed through the room, officially forging the unbreakable, legal salvation of the widow. The preacher blew softly upon the wet ink, then rolled the heavy document, handing it directly to the towering giant. The immediate danger of the valley hunters was completely neutralized. They possessed the undeniable proof. "The vows are sealed," the old preacher declared warmly, closing the heavy leather ledger. "You may kiss the bride." The heavy, peaceful silence of the church suddenly transformed into a suffocating, terrifying tension. Evelyn stood entirely still, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She remembered the sheer, violent panic of the mountain man when her delicate fingers had accidentally brushed against his calloused knuckles in the snow. She remembered the look of absolute, heartbreaking agony upon his scarred face. Silas froze entirely. The towering giant stared down at her delicate, beautiful face. The physical boundary between them was a massive, terrifying wall of hidden trauma. Will the fierce giant cross the terrifying physical boundary to make the beautiful lie look completely real? The dim, yellow light of the beeswax candles cast long, flickering shadows across the small wooden sanctuary of the parish. The old preacher waited with a gentle, encouraging smile. Silas stood entirely frozen before the simple wooden altar. The towering giant stared down at the delicate face of the beautiful widow. The terrifying physical boundary between them loomed like an impossible, jagged mountain peak. To kiss the fragile bride was to completely shatter the heavy, protective armor he had worn for a bitter, isolated decade. His thick, calloused hands trembled slightly at his sides. The fierce protector was completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of his own perceived unworthiness. Evelyn saw the profound, heartbreaking agony swimming within the deep brown eyes of the giant. She understood his silent panic perfectly. She did not wait for the massive man to force himself across the terrifying abyss. Instead, the fragile woman took the brave, decisive step into the absolute unknown. She rose up gently upon the tips of the thin leather soles of her boots. She did not reach for his hands. She lifted her pale, beautiful face toward him. With profound, breathtaking grace, she pressed her soft, delicate lips directly against the pale, jagged scar running along the heavy jaw of the mountain man. It was not a kiss of burning, reckless passion. It was a pure, overwhelming touch of absolute emotional acceptance. She deliberately kissed the very mark of his deepest physical trauma, silently proving that she found absolutely no horror in his broken pieces. Silas drew in a sharp, ragged breath. His massive chest expanded. He closed his intense eyes, entirely overwhelmed by the impossible, radiant warmth blooming against his weathered skin. The heavy weight of his past isolation cracked wide open in the quiet church. The morning sun began to pierce the dark winter clouds as they rode out of the quiet valley. They left the rolled parchment upon the wooden desk of the county clerk, long before the greedy brother, or the arrogant sheriff, could wake from their slumber. The brutal legal threat of the valley was completely severed. The fragile widow was now forever the legal wife of the beast of the high ridge. Yet, when they returned to the high mountain and the heavy oak door of the cabin closed securely behind them, the atmosphere inside the small room was entirely transformed. The heavy timber walls suddenly felt incredibly small. Before the terrifying ride into the dark valley, they were simply two desperate strangers, sharing a temporary shelter. They could hide their true feelings behind the desperate necessity of survival. Now, the heavy, sacred words of the altar hung vividly in the warm air. Every accidental glance carried the massive, crushing weight of their eternal vows. A profound mutual shyness settled over the cabin like a thick, suffocating blanket. Evelyn sat upon the heavy wooden bench, her pale hands resting neatly in the lap of her dark gray wool dress. Her beautiful face flushed crimson every time the towering giant walked past the table. Silas moved with extreme, awkward carefulness. The massive man seemed terrified of taking up too much space. The deep, heavy silence of the room screamed with unspoken longing and rapidly rising emotional tension. To escape the overwhelming pressure of the tiny room, Silas fled into the bitter cold. The fierce giant spent the entire afternoon outside in the freezing wind. He retrieved his heavy iron axe from the chopping block. He struck the frozen logs with a brutal, relentless rhythm. The loud, echoing cracks of splitting timber rang continuously across the snowy clearing. He completely ignored the burning ache of the healing wound bound tightly against his ribs. He pushed his massive, heavy body to the absolute physical limit, using the sheer exhaustion of the labor to drown out the loud, terrifying beating of his own lonely heart. Inside the warm cabin, Evelyn watched the scarred guardian through the small, frosted window panes. A deep, meaningful emotional reflection anchored her quiet spirit. The men of the valley always demanded immediate, violent possession of the things they desired. The quiet giant of the mountain chose to suffer in the freezing cold, simply to grant her the emotional space she desperately needed to breathe. His profound restraint was the most romantic, devastating gesture she had ever witnessed in her entire life. She moved away from the window to build the warmth of the home, She prepared a rich, savory stew in the iron pot over the glowing hearth. She carefully mended a small tear in the sleeve of his spare flannel shirt. Using a delicate needle and a length of dark thread she found hidden in the cupboards, she poured her overwhelming, silent gratitude into these quiet, domestic acts of care. Then, the subtle, biting breeze of the morning suddenly shifted. The tall pines surrounding the clearing began to sway violently under the crushing force of a sudden, terrifying gale. The temperature plummeted with an unnatural, lethal speed. The pale gray sky turned into a blinding, horizontal wall of furious white snow. The mountain roared with absolute fury. The heavy oak door burst open. Silas rushed across the threshold, carrying a massive load of split firewood in his thick arms. He dropped the heavy timber directly beside the stone hearth. He threw his massive weight against the thick wood of the door, straining fiercely to push the solid oak shut against the shrieking violence of the sudden blizzard. The heavy iron crossbar fell into place with a loud, ringing slam. The raging storm locked them completely inside the small, warm room. The fierce winter blizzard sealed the high ridge off entirely from the rest of the civilized world. There was absolutely nowhere left to run. There were no chores left to do outside in the freezing clearing. The massive giant and the delicate bride were completely trapped together within the heavy timber walls. Silas stood near the door, his broad shoulders rising and falling with heavy, exhausted breaths. He looked across the room at the startled widow. Slowly, despite the roaring chaos of the storm outside, he raised his thick hand and opened his calloused palm toward her. It was his subtle, recurring gesture, offering his silent, enduring promise of absolute shelter against the dark world. Evelyn stood near the table, the needle and thread frozen in her pale hands. The fire crackled brightly in the heavy stone hearth. The shadows danced across the small room. The space between the giant and the widow crackled with absolute, undeniable electricity. How long can the fierce guardian and the trembling widow possibly ignore the terrifying space between them while trapped inside the frozen storm? Consider the profound difference between the cold of the earth and the cold of the soul. My friends, a frozen landscape can be entirely melted by the arrival of the spring sun. But a frozen heart requires a completely different kind of fire to bring it back to life. Sometimes, the universe must force two wounded spirits into the absolute dark simply to make them realize they are the only source of light left in the world. The fierce winter blizzard roared against the heavy timber walls of the cabin for 3 endless, terrifying days. The furious storm completely buried the high mountain under a massive sea of white snow. The violent wind shrieked through the deep valley below, shaking the very foundation of the small, isolated home. Inside the single room, the desperate battle against the freezing air grew incredibly dire. The massive pile of chopped firewood beside the great stone hearth dwindled to a terrifyingly small handful of dry cedar logs. The radiant, comforting warmth of the cabin slowly surrendered to the bitter, creeping chill. Thick, white frost began to bloom aggressively across the interior planks of the heavy oak door. Silas stood before the fading fire. The towering mountain man placed the final 2 pieces of timber onto the glowing orange embers. The flames flared briefly, casting long, dancing shadows across his rugged, scarred face. The weak heat produced by the dying fire was entirely insufficient to fight the rapidly plummeting temperature of the room. The lethal, unforgiving cold of the high ridge was finally breaking into their quiet sanctuary. Evelyn sat upon the heavy wooden bench, wrapped tightly in the thick wool quilt. Her pale lips trembled violently. Her delicate, Shallow breath plumed into tiny white clouds in the freezing air of the cabin. Silas watched the freezing breath of the fragile widow. The fierce guardian recognized the deadly reality of the immediate situation. The tiny room would drop far below freezing before the morning sun could rise over the eastern ridge. If they remained separated, the bitter cold would undoubtedly claim the life of the delicate woman by dawn. The giant walked to the heavy timber bed in the dark corner. He gathered all the thick animal furs and layered them meticulously over the soft mattress. He created a deep, incredibly warm nest specifically designed for her fragile frame. He turned toward the table. He extended his massive, calloused hand, opening his thick palm toward the bed. It was his familiar, silent gesture of absolute shelter, ordering her to seek the sanctuary of the heavy blankets. Evelyn stood from the bench. She walked across the freezing floorboards and climbed beneath the massive weight of the furs. The rich, earthy warmth of the animal pelts immediately enveloped her shivering, exhausted body. She turned her delicate face toward the center of the room, expecting the giant to follow her. Silas remained near the dying fire. The towering protector walked slowly to the far wall. He picked up the single, thin gray blanket from the cold floorboards. He sat down heavily upon the unyielding wood directly in front of the frosted oak door. The massive man leaned his broad shoulders against the freezing timber. He folded his heavy, muscular arms tightly over his broad chest. He closed his intense, soulful brown eyes. He fully intended to sit upon the freezing floorboards for the entire night. The fierce mountain man was entirely willing to let the bitter cold freeze the blood in his own veins, simply to ensure the fragile widow possessed the thickest blankets in the room. It was a profound, completely foolish act of sacred sacrifice. Evelyn felt a sharp, devastating ache pierce the center of her chest. The delicate woman pushed the heavy wool quilt aside, exposing her pale shoulders to the biting air. "You will freeze to death upon the floor," Evelyn whispered softly. Her melodic voice cut cleanly through the heavy, moaning sounds of the storm outside. Silas opened his intense eyes. He shook his massive head a single time, completely refusing to move from his freezing post. "The fire is dying," Evelyn insisted, her tone suddenly carrying a fierce, undeniable authority she had never possessed in the valley. "The heavy blankets are completely useless without the steady heat of a living body. If you remain upon the floor, we will both perish in the dark." The mountain man stared at her through the deep shadows. The intense terror of crossing the physical boundary battled violently against his absolute, ancient instinct to ensure her survival. To share the small space of the bed was to completely shatter the final, heavy wall of his emotional armor. He believed he was a monster entirely unworthy of such intimate comfort. Evelyn did not wait for the giant to overcome his deep terror. She peeled back the thick furs entirely, exposing the empty half of the mattress to the freezing air. She patted the soft surface with her pale, delicate hand. "Come here," the beautiful widow commanded softly, locking her sorrowful, emerald green eyes directly onto the scarred face of the guardian. Slowly, reluctantly, the massive giant pushed his heavy frame up from the freezing floorboards. He walked across the dark room with heavy, incredibly hesitant steps. He stood beside the bed, staring down at the empty space as if it were a terrifying, bottomless canyon. With agonizing, careful slowness, Silas sat upon the very edge of the mattress. He lay back upon the soft surface, remaining fully clothed in his heavy canvas coat and thick trousers. He pressed his broad back completely against the far wall of the log cabin. He tried desperately to take up as little space as possible. He was a towering mountain of a human being, yet he actively made his massive body incredibly small to avoid frightening her. Evelyn lay down beside him. She pulled the heavy layers of the thick furs over both of them, sealing out the freezing air of the cabin completely. The bitter darkness of the room pressed down heavily upon the bed. But beneath the thick pelts, a profound, undeniable magic immediately began to take hold. The sheer, immense heat radiating from the broad chest of the mountain man was absolutely incredible. Silas was a living, breathing furnace of pure life. The terrible, biting cold, locked deep within the fragile bones of the widow, melted away entirely. The forced, desperate proximity of their physical survival completely stripped away the lingering awkwardness of their spoken vows. The raw bass, beautiful necessity of shared warmth, bound the trembling widow and the scarred giant together in the dark. The fierce storm roared furiously against the heavy timber roof. The winter wind screamed wildly through the dark valley below. Yet, beneath the heavy wool quilt, the world was perfectly, beautifully still. As the deep, endless night stretched on, the trembling exhaustion of the widow finally overtook her fragile body. In the soft, quiet depths of her sleep, Evelyn instinctively gravitated toward the absolute safety of the massive guardian. She shifted closer across the mattress. Her delicate head came to rest gently against the thick, warm canvas of his heavy coat. Silas did not flinch. The towering giant remained perfectly still, hardly daring to pull the air into his lungs. He slowly, incredibly gently, lifted his massive, heavy arm. He wrapped his thick, protective embrace completely around her fragile shoulders, drawing her against his broad side. He held the sleeping woman with the profound, overwhelming reverence of a man holding the most precious, delicate treasure of the entire earth. And the deep, steady rhythm of his heavy heart beat softly against her ear. Evelyn stirred in the warm, comforting darkness. The gentle movement caused her pale, delicate hand to slip slightly inside the unbuttoned collar of the faded flannel shirt of the giant. Her fragile fingers brushed directly against the bare skin of his broad chest. She did not pull away from the unexpected touch. Instead, she felt a terrible, uneven texture marring his flesh. Beneath the heavy fabric, the massive chest of the mountain man was completely covered in thick, jagged, raised ridges. They were brutal, terrifying scars that spoke of an unbelievable, agonizing violence from the past. The terrible marks felt exactly like deep, savage claw wounds permanently etched into the solid muscle of his torso. The delicate widow opened her sorrowful green eyes in the pitch-black room. The gentle, steady heartbeat of the man beneath her palm contrasted sharply with the terrifying physical evidence of his horrific trauma. The heavy wall of silence that had surrounded the quiet giant for a bitter decade suddenly felt profoundly fragile. She understood immediately why he feared the touch of another human being. "What monster did this to you?" Evelyn breathed into the quiet darkness, her soft voice filled with absolute, overwhelming compassion. The massive chest of the mountain man hitched violently. His heavy breath caught sharply in his throat. The terrifying shadows of his deepest, darkest secret flooded the tiny, intimate space beneath the thick furs. Will the silent guardian finally speak the terrible truth of his tragic past? The heavy darkness of the cabin felt entirely suspended in time. The delicate fingers of the fragile widow remained gently pressed against the brutal, raised ridges covering the massive chest of the mountain man. She did not pull away in terror. Instead, she traced the terrible, jagged lines with profound, breathtaking reverence. The deep, heavy silence of the small room stretched on, filled only by the shrieking wind of the violent blizzard battering the heavy timber walls. Silas drew in a slow, incredibly ragged breath. The massive chest of the giant expanded beneath her pale hand. The fierce protector had hidden his agonizing trauma from the world for a bitter decade, burying his crushing guilt beneath absolute isolation. Yet, the radiant, this pure acceptance radiating from the delicate woman, completely shattered the heavy iron vault of his guarded soul. He opened his intense brown eyes in the pitch-black room. He stared up at the heavy, unseen timber of the ceiling. I was completely blind, Silas rumbled into the quiet darkness. His deep voice vibrated heavily through the mattress, cracking with the devastating weight of ancient sorrow. I believed my immense size and my physical strength could conquer the wildness of this earth. I believed I could effortlessly protect the innocent. Evelyn lay perfectly still, holding her gentle breath to listen to the broken confession of the giant. Her name was Amelia, the mountain man whispered, the tragic name catching painfully in his throat. She was the younger sister of my youth. We walked the lower trails of the high ridge during the early spring. We sought the wild berries growing near the deep river. I walked too far ahead. I did not keep my watchful eyes upon the dark timber. A low, agonizing tremor shook the towering frame of the fierce guardian. Evelyn instinctively moved her fragile body closer, pressing her pale cheek firmly against the thick canvas coat of his broad shoulder, offering her quiet, undeniable emotional support. The grizzly bear emerged from the deep shadows without a single sound. Silas breathed, his voice thick with absolute devastation. The beast was massive, consumed by the blind rage of starvation. The monster ignored me completely and charged directly toward the fragile form of my sister. The terrifying imagery filled the dark room. The delicate widow closed her sorrowful green eyes, her fragile heart aching profoundly for the helpless, innocent girl, and for the desperate brother who watched the nightmare unfold. I threw myself upon the massive back of the wild beast, the giant continued, the terrifying memory flooding his heavy words. I possessed no heavy iron axe. I fought the monster of the mountain with nothing but my bare hands. I commanded Amelia to run toward the safety of the rocky caves. I fought the creature upon the frozen earth. The jagged claws of the beast tore violently through the flesh of my chest. The terrible jaws of the monster crushed the solid bone of my jawline. Silas swallowed hard, entirely consumed by the bitter ghosts of his dark past. I broke the neck of the terrible beast, Silas whispered. A solitary, hot tear finally escaping his intense eye and sliding down into the thick hair of his rugged beard. I dragged my broken, bleeding body across the bitter snow to find my sister. But I was far too late. The bitter cold of the deep evening had already claimed her fragile life while I lay unconscious upon the frozen earth. I failed my most sacred duty. I failed to protect the single soul who depended upon my sheer strength. A profound, beautiful emotional reflection settled over the delicate spirit of Evelyn. The men of the valley wore fine-tailored suits and believed themselves deeply honorable simply because they possessed extensive wealth. Yet, this towering, heavily scarred giant believed himself an absolute monster, purely because he could not single-handedly defeat the brutal forces of nature to save a cherished life. His deep isolation was not born of true savagery. His isolation was born of a sacred, crushing guilt. He banished himself to the freezing mountain because he truly believed he was completely unworthy of possessing a family ever again. I am cursed, the mountain man rumbled, his voice dropping to a broken, desolate whisper. The deep scars upon my flesh are a permanent, horrifying punishment for my absolute failure. I am entirely unworthy of holding a gentle creature. I am completely unworthy of the radiant warmth you bring to this cold room. The fierce guardian squeezed his dark eyes tightly shut, waiting for the fragile woman to pull away from his deformed, unworthy body. He expected the inevitable rejection. He braced his massive frame for the bitter coldness of her departure. Evelyn did not move away. Instead, the delicate widow shifted completely out from beneath the heavy wool quilt. She lifted her slender torso in the dark, entirely ignoring the freezing air of the cabin. She moved her pale hand from the massive chest of the mountain man and reached upward. With infinite, overwhelming gentleness, she placed her warm, delicate palm directly against the rugged, weathered cheek of the fierce giant. Her soft fingers traced the very edge of the pale scar running along his heavy jawline. "You are not a monster," Evelyn murmured softly, her melodic voice ringing with absolute, fierce conviction in the dark room. "You are the most honorable, beautiful soul I have ever known. You sacrificed your own flesh, your own blood, and your own comfort to save a delicate life. You did not fail her. Silas, you gave absolutely everything you possessed to fight the darkness for her." The massive giant stopped breathing entirely. "The men who traded me away in the valley possess completely unblemished skin," the beautiful widow breathed, her delicate thumb gently wiping the single hot tear from his rough cheek. "Yet the dark souls of those men are entirely rotten. The terrible scars upon your broad chest do not mark a failure. They are the undeniable proof of a sacred, powerful love. You are a true guardian." The heavy, impenetrable emotional armor of the towering mountain man finally shattered into 1,000 beautiful pieces. Silas turned his rugged face slowly, leaning his heavy, scarred cheek completely into the warm, delicate palm of the fragile woman. It was an act of total, absolute emotional surrender. The fierce protector finally allowed himself to be fully comforted. The deep, agonizing psychological wounds of a bitter decade began to stitch themselves closed beneath the incredible, radiant grace of the delicate bride. They lingered in the beautiful, profound silence of the heavy darkness. Absolute emotional dependence firmly bound their wounded souls together. Silas slowly lifted his thick, calloused hand, placing his heavy fingers gently over the pale hand, resting against his face. The violent blizzard outside suddenly ceased. The shrieking wind died away entirely, leaving the high mountain enveloped in a heavy, deafening stillness. Then, the peaceful, intimate sanctuary of the dark cabin was violently shattered. A massive, terrifying crash slammed directly against the exterior of the heavy oak door. The heavy timber of the solid walls shuddered violently. The sound of shouting men and the loud, metallic clacking of rifle levers echoed loudly through the freezing clearing. The hunters of the valley had somehow survived the terrible storm, and they had finally reached the high ridge. Silas ripped his intense brown eyes open, the raw terror for his delicate bride instantly replacing the profound peace of his healing soul. What horrifying lengths will the cruel men of the valley go to in order to rip the fragile woman from the arms of the fierce giant? The violent crash against the heavy oak door shattered the sacred, peaceful stillness of the dark cabin like a pane of brittle glass. The intimate, beautiful sanctuary they had carefully built beneath the thick firs evaporated in a single, terrifying instant. Silas rolled from the soft mattress with explosive, terrifying speed. The massive mountain man entirely abandoned the quiet, emotional vulnerability of his profound confession. The fierce guardian instantly returned. He pulled his heavy leather boots onto his feet. He seized his massive iron axe from the corner of the room, his thick, calloused knuckles turning completely white around the heavy hickory handle. outside the heavy timber walls. The heavy boots of the valley hunters crunched loudly against the deep, frozen snow. The bitter winter blizzard had finally broken, leaving behind a clear, freezing dawn. The cruel men of the valley had forced their exhausted horses through the massive snowdrifts. The very moment the screaming wind ceased. Bring out the fragile widow. Mountain beast, the arrogant, vicious voice of the wealthy brother, shouted across the freezing clearing. The cruel demand easily pierced the heavy log walls. The storm delayed the judgment of the valley, but the law of the estate will not be denied. We bring heavy rifles and burning pitch. Evelyn stood from the heavy timber bed, pulling the thick wool quilt tightly around her, trembling, delicate frame. The blind, paralyzing terror returned to her sorrowful emerald green eyes. If you refuse to open the door, we will burn the entire cabin to the frozen earth, the brother threatened wildly. The loud, metallic clacking of heavy rifle levers echoed violently in the crisp morning air. The sudden, terrifying smell of burning pine pitch began to leak through the small cracks of the heavy window frames. The orange, salve, flickering light of lit torches danced dangerously against the frosted glass. Silas stood in the center of the dark room. The massive giant knew the heavy oak door could withstand the brutal physical force of men, but the dry cedar logs of the roof would catch fire with terrifying speed. The hunters intended to burn them alive if he did not immediately surrender the beautiful bride. The fierce mountain man turned his intense brown eyes toward Evelyn. He did not possess a single firearm. He possessed only his massive physical strength, his heavy iron axe, and his absolute, unshakable honor. He fully intended to walk out onto the freezing wooden porch to face a dozen armed men entirely alone. It was the ultimate, sacred sacrifice. He would gladly trade his own beating heart to ensure the survival of the fragile woman. Silas moved toward the center of the room. He shoved the heavy, rough-hewn table aside with one effortless push of his thick hand. He lifted the heavy woven rug from the dusty floorboards. Beneath the thick fabric lay a hidden, square wooden trapdoor leading directly down into the deep, freezing stone root cellar. The towering giant pulled the heavy iron ring. The thick timber door groaned loudly as it swung open, revealing the pitch-black, freezing depths of the earth beneath the heavy cabin. He walked back to the fragile widow. Silas reached out with both of his massive, calloused hands. He grasped the delicate shoulders of the trembling woman with profound, overwhelming gentleness. The men of the valley will throw their burning torches onto the dry cedar roof, Silas rumbled. His deep, heavy voice remained incredibly calm, completely ignoring the horrifying chaos erupting just outside the barricaded door. I must step outside to face the violent hunters. I will draw their brutal anger entirely away from the heavy timber of the cabin. Evelyn shook her delicate head violently. The absolute, suffocating terror of losing the fierce giant completely consumed her fragile soul. The terrifying fear of loss finally reached its absolute, agonizing peak. The formal vows of the altar were no longer simply ink upon a legal paper. She loved the scarred, honorable protector with every ounce of her broken spirit. Do not walk out into the snow, Evelyn pleaded desperately. Her pale hands grasped the thick canvas of his heavy coat, her delicate knuckles turning white with fierce determination. They possess a dozen heavy rifles. They will shoot you upon the wooden porch. I absolutely cannot lose the single beautiful thing I have discovered in this dark world. You will not lose the light. The massive man breathed softly, his rough thumb gently brushing a hot, terrified tear from her pale cheek. You must climb down into the deep, dark earth. You must remain completely silent in the absolute shadows. Do not emerge from the stone cellar, no matter the terrible sounds you hear from the clearing above. A heavy stone slammed violently against the frosted window pane, shattering the thick glass entirely. The bitter, freezing wind howled through the broken window, carrying the loud, cruel laughter of the valley hunters directly into the warm room. Silas did not wait for the fragile woman to agree to its desperate plan. He lifted her delicate body with immense, sacred care. He carried her to the open trapdoor. He lowered her fragile form slowly into the freezing, pitch-black darkness of the stone root cellar. Evelyn clung desperately to the heavy sleeve of his canvas coat. She was entirely unwilling to let the scarred guardian walk to his own brutal execution. "Please," the weeping widow sobbed quietly, the devastating sound tearing violently at the very heart of the giant. "Do not leave me alone in the dark." Silas gently untangled her pale, trembling fingers from the thick fabric of his heavy coat. The massive giant knelt beside the open square of the floorboards. He lowered his rugged, scarred face into the heavy darkness, bringing his intense, soulful brown eyes perfectly level with her sorrowful green eyes for the final time. He prepared to close the heavy wooden door, fully intending to sacrifice his massive body to the brutal rifles of the valley to ensure her absolute, permanent survival. The fierce giant leaned closely toward the pale face of the weeping bride. He whispered a final, devastating string of words into the freezing shadows before he dropped the heavy timber door shut, completely sealing the fragile woman safely in the dark, and walking toward the violent end of his own life. What were the final, heartbreaking words of the fierce giant? "You brought the radiant warmth of heaven into my freezing world," the massive giant whispered into the heavy darkness. "I lived 1,000 bitter lifetimes in the cold, and I would gladly surrender every single breath to protect the one beautiful night I spent with you. Survive the long dark. My beautiful wife." The heavy timber door dropped violently shut. The pitch-black darkness of the stone root cellar completely swallowed the fragile widow. The heavy iron latch locked securely from the floorboards above. Evelyn sat upon the damp, freezing earth. She heard the muffled, heavy footsteps of the towering mountain man walking away from the hidden trapdoor. She heard the loud, metallic clang of the heavy iron crossbar lifting from the cradle. The heavy oak door of the cabin swung open. The loud, vicious voices of the valley hunters immediately flooded the clearing above. "Step aside, mountain beast," the cruel voice of the wealthy brother shouted. "You face a dozen heavy rifles. Surrender the fragile widow to the legal authority of the estate, or we will leave your massive body bleeding in the deep snow." The deep, rumbling voice of the fierce giant echoed with absolute, unyielding authority. "You will not cross the threshold of my home. You will not touch the woman. She is the legal wife of the High Ridge." Evelyn pressed her pale, trembling hands against the cold stone of the cellar wall. A profound, shattering emotional reflection completely overtook her delicate soul. For her entire life, she had played the role of the passive, suffering victim. She had allowed the respected gentleman of the valley to dictate her worth, steal her dignity, and trade her away like a broken animal. She had expected the world to crush her, and she had accepted the cruelty with a bowed head. But the towering giant of the high mountain had taught her a vastly different truth. Silas had dropped to his bleeding knees to show her respect. Silas had sacrificed his own failing body to ensure her comfort. The fierce guardian had faced a literal monster of the forest, purely to protect his innocent sister. And now he stood upon the freezing porch, fully prepared to sacrifice his own life to protect his innocent bride. Evelyn wiped the hot, terrified tears from her pale cheeks. A sudden, Fierce fire ignited deep within her fragile chest. She refused to hide in the dark. She refused to let the honorable mountain man die alone in the freezing snow. She was no longer the trembling, discarded widow of the valley. She was the fiercely loved wife of the giant, and she belonged exactly by his side. The delicate woman scrambled across the freezing dirt floor of the cellar. She felt along the rough stone foundation with desperate, searching fingers. Her pale hands brushed against a small, square frame of heavy wood built directly into the upper wall of the stone cellar. It was a narrow chute, designed for loading winter coal into the basement from the outside clearing. She pushed her delicate hands against the thick wooden panel. The heavy wood was frozen solidly shut by the bitter ice of the blizzard. Above her head, the loud, metallic clacking of heavy rifle levers signaled the absolute, terrifying end of the standoff. "Raise your weapons," the wealthy brother commanded loudly. "Put the beast down." Evelyn let out a sharp, desperate cry. She completely ignored the agonizing pain in her slender wrists. She threw the entire weight of her fragile body against the frozen wood. She fought with the exact same relentless, overwhelming desperation the giant had used to fight the wild grizzly bear. She struck the heavy panel again and again. The thick ice finally cracked. The small wooden door burst open, revealing the blinding, pristine white light of the morning sun. The delicate woman dragged her slender body up through the narrow chute. She tumbled out into the freezing, deep snowdrift piled directly against the side of the heavy timber cabin. The bitter winter wind immediately bit into her pale skin, but she did not feel the cold. She stumbled to her feet. The dark gray wool dress of the fragile widow stood out sharply against the blinding white snow. She ran around the corner of the log cabin. The terrifying scene in the clearing froze the breath in her lungs. The wealthy brother sat upon his dark horse, pointing a heavy pistol directly toward the wooden porch. The dozen hired hunters stood in a wide semicircle, their heavy rifles raised and aimed firmly at the massive chest of her husband. Silas stood entirely alone upon the top step. The massive mountain man gripped his heavy iron axe in his thick, calloused hands. His broad shoulders were pulled back. His rugged, scarred face was a mask of absolute, lethal determination. The fierce protector was fully prepared to charge directly into the wall of flying lead, intending to trade his massive life for her permanent safety. "Fire!" the arrogant brother screamed wildly. Evelyn did not scream. She did not cower. The delicate woman moved with incredible, explosive speed. She rushed past the heavy snowdrifts. She climbed the wooden steps of the porch. Just as the cruel hunters tightened their gloved fingers upon the heavy iron triggers, Evelyn stepped directly in front of the towering mountain man. She positioned her fragile, slender body as an absolute, impenetrable shield between the heavy rifles of the valley and the broad, scarred chest of her husband. She raised her pale, delicate chin. Her sorrowful emerald green eyes burned with an intense, unwavering fury. Silas gasped loudly in profound horror. The massive giant immediately dropped his heavy iron axe onto the wooden floorboards. The fierce protector reached out with his massive hands, desperately trying to pull the fragile woman back behind his broad shoulders. Evelyn refused to move. She reached back with one pale hand, grasping the thick, calloused fingers of the giant in a grip of absolute, unyielding iron. She anchored the massive man to the earth, proving that they would face the absolute darkness completely together. The hired hunters froze entirely. The heavy rifles wavered in the freezing air. The men of the valley had expected to shoot a wild, savage beast. They absolutely did not expect to shoot a beautiful, delicate woman dressed in mourning wool. standing with the fierce, unshakable courage of a mountain lioness, defending her mate. The incredible, breathtaking sight of the fragile woman, deliberately shielding the terrifying giant, completely shattered the violent momentum of the standoff. "Shoot them both," the wealthy brother shrieked, his face twisting into a mask of pure, absolute malice. "She is a thief and a fugitive. Fire your weapons." The hired men exchanged deeply uncertain glances. The heavy rifles pointed at the pale chest of the delicate bride. Can the sight of her pure, unwavering devotion truly stop the heavy bullets of the cruel valley hunters? The fierce winter wind held its breath. The heavy, suffocating tension of the violent standoff completely silenced the high mountain. The hired hunters of the valley froze in the deep, freezing snowdrift, their heavy rifles wavering in the crisp, blinding sunlight. They had marched up the treacherous trail, expecting to slaughter a savage, solitary beast. They absolutely did not expect to confront a breathtakingly beautiful, delicate woman standing as an absolute, impenetrable shield of pure devotion. Evelyn did not tremble. The paralyzing fear that had governed the entire tragic life of the fragile widow vanished into the freezing air, completely replaced by an ancient, unstoppable fire. She stood upon the frozen wooden planks of the porch. She maintained an absolute, unyielding grip upon the thick, calloused fingers of the massive giant standing directly behind her. The sheer, radiating heat of his massive hand anchored her soaring spirit. "Shoot them both," the wealthy brother shrieked again. His face twisted into a grotesque mask of absolute, pathetic desperation. "Do not stare at the woman. She is a known thief. Earn the gold of the estate." Evelyn raised her pale, delicate chin. Her sorrowful emerald green eyes locked directly onto the rugged faces of the hired men. "There is absolutely no law of the estate," Evelyn spoke. Her melodic voice did not shake or break. It carried across the freezing clearing with the profound, resounding clarity of a heavy iron church bell. "You speak of frontier justice, but you take the silver of a cowardly thief, hiding behind the heavy rifles of working men." The leader of the hunters frowned deeply. The cruel mandate of the wealthy brother suddenly felt entirely hollow against the undeniable, radiant truth shining from the delicate face of the fragile bride. "He stole the vast wealth of his own brother," Evelyn declared, projecting her voice to ensure every armed man heard the absolute truth. "He deliberately forged the ledger of the family. He discarded me into the bitter, freezing night of the high ridge, hoping the brutal winter cold or the wild mountain beasts would silence his terrible crimes forever. He paid you to become murderers, not enforcers of the law." The wealthy brother turned a sickening shade of pale. "Silence the lying woman," the coward commanded, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Fire the weapons." But the hunters did not pull the heavy iron triggers. The working men of the valley possessed their own deeply ingrained honor. They looked at the terrified, sweating face of the wealthy brother, and then they looked at the monumental, breathtaking courage of the fragile widow protecting the scarred guardian. In that precise, suspended moment, a profound, earth-shattering emotional revelation completely consumed the heavy heart of Silas. The fierce mountain man looked down at the delicate, pale woman shielding his broad chest. For an entire, bitter decade, he had believed he was a cursed, broken monster. He believed he was completely unworthy of receiving any tenderness, protection, or love. He believed his only value upon the earth was to serve as a disposable shield for others. Yet, in the face of absolute, terrifying death, this beautiful, fragile creature had deliberately chosen to become the shield for him. She loved the scarred giant enough to die for him. The heavy, this dark curse of his tragic past, shattered completely. The massive man realized he was completely, undeniably worthy of love. Simultaneously, the ultimate transformation solidified within the delicate soul of Evelyn. She realized she was no longer a broken, suffering victim waiting for the cruel world to crush her. She possessed the fierce, unstoppable strength of the solid mountain stone. She had faced the absolute worst cruelty of the men of the valley, and she had emerged entirely victorious. She was the fierce, undeniable protector of her own home. The leader of the hired hunters slowly lowered the heavy iron barrel of his rifle. He spat a dark stream of tobacco into the pristine white snow. "We are honest trackers and hunters," the rugged man muttered, glaring at the wealthy brother with absolute, undisguised disgust. "We do not shoot innocent women standing upon their own wooden porch. We do not execute honorable men, defending their own lawful wives. You lied to the valley. You carry no legal authority upon this ridge." The leader turned his dark horse toward the downward trail. The other hunters immediately followed his command. They lowered the heavy weapons, turning the exhausted horses completely away from the heavy timber cabin. The brutal, violent contract was permanently broken. They abandoned the wealthy man to the harsh, unforgiving justice of the mountain. The wealthy brother looked around the empty clearing in sheer, absolute panic. He was entirely alone in the deep snow, facing the furious, towering giant of the high ridge and the fiercely protected widow. The coward did not dare to speak another word. He violently spurred his dark horse, fleeing blindly down the treacherous mountain trail in absolute, pathetic terror. The heavy threat of the valley evaporated into the crisp morning air. The violent chaos vanished entirely. The high mountain was enveloped in a profound, breathtaking peace. The pristine white snow glittered beautifully beneath the rising golden sun. Silas stepped forward. He stood directly beside his fierce, beautiful bride. He reached down and gently gathered her fragile, trembling body into his massive, heavy arms. He pulled her flush against the broad canvas of his heavy coat, burying his scarred face directly into the soft, fragrant waves of her auburn hair. Evelyn wrapped her pale arms completely around the massive torso of the giant. She buried her delicate face against his chest, listening to the heavy, rapid beating of his massive heart. The radiant, overwhelming warmth between them melted the bitter cold of the surrounding world entirely. It was a moment of absolute, triumphant emotional catharsis. They had forged a family out of pure desperation, and the unbreakable bond had saved both of their lives. They stood upon the wooden porch for a long, beautiful time, completely surrounded by the absolute silence of the mountain. The sacred victory belonged entirely to them. The deep, agonizing wounds of their tragic pasts were permanently healed. Yet, as the intense adrenaline slowly faded from her fragile veins, a sudden, quiet anxiety crept into the mind of the beautiful widow. The heavy rifles of the valley were gone. The cruel brother was permanently banished. The terrifying, immediate danger that had forced them to stand before the altar of the old preacher was completely neutralized. They no longer needed the legal paper to survive the wrath of the town. Silas stepped back slowly, loosening his massive arms from around her slender waist. His intense, soulful brown eyes studied the delicate face of the fragile woman. The heavy, unbreakable silence of the quiet giant returned to the space between them. What will the fierce guardian say now that the brutal danger forcing them together is entirely gone? The crisp, freezing morning air settled deeply over the high ridge, carrying the pure, blinding light of the rising sun. The heavy winter wind finally ceased its violent howling, leaving the heavy, dark green branches of the tall pine trees perfectly still. The thick, pristine snowdrifts sparkled brilliantly, reflecting the pure gold of the absolute dawn. The heavy, terrifying threat of the valley was completely erased from the clearing, banished by the absolute, breathtaking courage of the beautiful bride. Silas stood upon the solid wooden planks of the porch, looking down at the delicate, fragile woman standing before him. The fierce mountain man swallowed hard. The massive chest of the giant rose and fell with a heavy, uneven rhythm. The loud, pounding heartbeat of the scarred guardian completely filled his own ears. The cruel men of the valley will never return to this mountain, Silas rumbled. His deep, heavy voice broke the pristine silence of the clearing, carrying an incredible, profound gentleness. The legal paper of the county served the ultimate purpose. The greedy family cannot touch you or claim you. You are completely safe from the darkness of your past. Evelyn stood entirely still upon the frosted wood. The sorrowful emerald green eyes of the widow suddenly filled with hot, terrified tears. The fragile woman completely misunderstood the profound, honorable restraint of the quiet giant. She believed he was officially granting her the permanent freedom to leave the high ridge. She believed the temporary arrangement of their survival was officially terminated. Now that the brutal danger was entirely gone, I possess absolutely no desire to return to the valley, Evelyn whispered desperately. Her delicate, pale hands trembled violently as she reached forward, clutching the thick canvas of his heavy coat. I possess absolutely no desire to leave the warmth of the cabin. Please do not send me away. Silas stared down at the pale, tearful face of his beautiful bride. A look of absolute, overwhelming wonder broke completely through the rugged, scarred features of the guardian. The fierce protector finally truly understood that the fragile woman was not trapped by any legal obligation. She was firmly anchored to the brutal mountain by pure, undeniable love. The massive mountain man took one slow, deliberate step backward. He looked deeply into the sorrowful green eyes of the trembling widow. Then, for the second time in their incredible, transformative journey, the fierce giant moved with profound, absolute slowness. He did not drop to his knees in the freezing snow to prove he was a harmless creature. He lowered his towering, massive frame onto the solid wooden planks of the porch for an entirely different, infinitely more beautiful purpose. He sank straight down, resting his heavy knees upon the cold wood. He completely surrendered his immense physical height, bringing his intense, soulful brown eyes perfectly level with the delicate face of the beautiful bride. He reached out with both of his massive, calloused hands. He took the pale, trembling fingers of the fragile woman, completely engulfing her delicate hands within his overwhelming, protective warmth. I knelt in the bitter snow on the first night to prove I was not a terrifying monster, Silas breathed, his deep voice thick with absolute, pure devotion. I kneel before you in the bright sunlight today to offer you the entirety of my broken soul. The legal paper of the county bound us together to survive the cruelty of the world. But I am asking you to stay upon the high mountain by absolute, free choice. If you will accept the scarred heart of a fierce guardian, I will cherish you, protect you, and honor you until the final breath entirely leaves my lungs. Evelyn let out a sharp, joyful sob. The absolute, undeniable emotional payoff flooded her fragile spirit, completely washing away the sorrow of a bitter lifetime. She did not force the massive man to remain upon the floorboards alone. The delicate widow immediately dropped to her own knees, joining the fierce giant upon the cold wooden porch. They rested, perfectly equal in the radiant light of the golden morning. "You are the only true home I have ever known," Evelyn murmured, her soft voice ringing with absolute, fierce joy. "I completely accept your beautiful heart, Silas. I am already exactly where I belong." The towering mountain man closed his intense brown eyes. A heavy, ragged exhale of pure, ultimate relief escaped his broad chest. He lifted his thick, calloused hands, gently framing the pale, delicate face of the beautiful woman. He leaned forward, closing the final, terrifying physical boundary between them, forever. He pressed his warm, gentle lips directly against the soft lips of the delicate bride. It was not a desperate kiss of pure survival. It was a beautiful kiss of profound, fully earned emotional resolution. The heavy, dark curse of the bitter past shattered entirely, melting away into the crisp winter air like thin morning frost. The fierce giant and the delicate widow poured their entire souls into the healing embrace, entirely surrounded by the immense, quiet majesty of the absolute wild. Let us watch the dancing embers of the campfire slowly fade into the quiet night. My friends, the beautiful story of the fierce mountain man and the delicate widow teaches us a profound, enduring lesson about the true, absolute nature of human strength. The grand society of the valley firmly believed that true power resided in vast, unearned wealth, fine tailored suits, and the cruel dominance over fragile things. Yet, the absolute truth of the world reveals a vastly different, more beautiful reality. True strength is not the ability to swing a heavy iron axe, nor is it the ability to intimidate a broken spirit. True strength is the quiet, unyielding courage required to lower your massive shields, drop to your knees, and expose a heavily scarred heart to the terrifying possibility of pure love. Silas and Evelyn built a magnificent, beautiful life upon the high ridge. The heavy timber cabin never felt cold or empty ever again. The delicate widow entirely transformed the lonely, echoing shelter into a radiant sanctuary of absolute warmth. She filled the heavy log walls with the rich scent of baking bread, and the constant, joyful hum of unconditional, endless love. The deep, terrifying scars upon the broad chest of the mountain man never vanished, but they completely lost their tragic, dark power. They became the honored nap of a fierce protector, completely loved and revered by the family he eventually built. In the passing years, the joyful laughter of strong, beautiful children echoed across the snowy clearing, completely replacing the bitter, heavy silence of the dark past. The wild creatures of the mountain frequently visited the quiet clearing, recognizing the pure, healing grace that resided within the small home. They learned together that absolute salvation does not arrive in the form of a legal document or a grand, dramatic rescue. True salvation arrives when two completely broken souls look at the shattered pieces of each other and decide to build a permanent, beautiful home together. Thank you for sharing this quiet journey with me. May you always find the courage to build your own radiant warmth in the freezing dark. This story is a work of fiction. The characters, events, and scenarios are entirely products of the imagination of the author, and are intended for entertainment and emotional reflection. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This narrative promotes wholesome family values, emotional healing, and resilience.